Hello, I'm Paul Beckwith, and this is MOP. No fancy name like Shackleton the Explorer, named after the Antarctic great Antarctic explorer, but just MOP. Fuzzy Mop. Now Mop is pretty shy, pretty camera shy. So as soon as I stop paying attention to her, she's going to bolt. But she's like a younger version of Shackleton, much fluffier and fuzzier. But when she was a little kitten, as soon as you picked her up, she would purr so loud. But now she pretty much her personality's changed completely, and she likes her own space. So in this video, I'm going to talk all about the U.S. military and how a report came out recently that they could collapse within 20 years due to climate change. And this is a report that was commissioned by the Pentagon, actually says that. And one, or I believe the top U.S. general, commissioned the report. And it's quite alarming what it says, but I think it approaches more of the reality of the situation than lots of other reports and things that I've seen. So I'm going to talk about a lot of different things in this series of videos, including the carbon budgets of the military, including one of the weakest points of the whole infrastructure of civilization. I mean, when we talk about civilization collapsing, what do we really mean? I mean, we talk about, we mean things like global food shortages, water shortages, lots of regional conflicts. But, one of the biggest indications is a collapse of the electrical grid, a collapse of the power grid would basically, our society relies on power so much. Power is everything. Electricity is everything. Without it, we basically go back to the Stone Ages, to the Dark Ages. And there's actually worrying signs in many different countries of this collapse occurring. And not just, developing countries, but developed countries. I mean, you know what I'm talking about if you're up on the news. I'm talking about the shutting down of the power grid, the actual completely flimsy nature of the power grid in California. High winds pick up, and the company PG&E, which private company, went bankrupt a few years ago, mostly because of lawsuits, because their power grid is very, very flimsy. So high winds blow it over. Those high winds associated with winds coming from the Sierra Nevada. So they're high up, cold, dry air comes down by gravity, goes through the valleys, accelerates, knocks over the power lines, creating sparks, triggering wildfires. It's very hot and dry at that time of year. And this is exactly what we're seeing right now in California. So I'm going to I always try to sort of take a view of a systems view and try to connect all of the different components and pieces. And what we're experiencing right now is cascading feedbacks kicking in and causing enormous consequences to humanity. I mean, when we talk about civilization collapsing, it's not all or nothing. It's not all over the world simultaneous. The weaker places, the places that have, big glaring Achilles heels, if you like, or weak spots, those are the places that can collapse quickly. And it can be very surprising to people because, some of the, what you might think some of the weaker countries are and most likely to collapse, they'll actually turn out to be a lot more resilient. Some of the countries that you think are wealthier and stronger and more resilient fold like a pack of cards, basically. Okay, so let's get right into it. So this is a report. So Google this title and have a look at this is the best article that I've found on this report. So I'll go into some of the details. But before I do that, I want to remind you, this is my website, paulbeckwith.net. And please consider making a donation to my website. And I have a plane ticket to Santiago, Chile. So I'm going to the climate conference for the first 2 weeks of December. I'll be giving lots of presentations, meeting people like Greta Thunberg and James Hansen. And there's going to be loads of people there. And I'll be working with a group called Scientist Warning, working for them. I'll be volunteering for them. So, I'm basically, this is out of my own pocket. So please consider donating to my PayPal to support my trip. And also, GoFundMe has just been set up specifically to raise money to offset travel costs. And I'll make sure I give you those links and everything. I'll be tweeting those links out shortly. Okay, so I have to remind people, to try to think of the big picture, try to think of the overall climate system. It's not just the weather events, it's the long-term changes in the weather events, it's the distribution of how heat is moved on the planet, whether it be via the atmosphere or the oceans. It's about certain regions of the planet warming way, way faster than other regions, like the Arctic, of course, comes to mind, but not just the Arctic. Land warms much faster than water, and high latitudes, the Arctic and Antarctic warm much faster than lower latitudes. Also, higher elevations warm much faster than lower elevations. So there's all of these different dynamic effects occurring, which are greatly stressing human civilization. So if you go to my Twitter account, I pinned this tweet at the moment. U.S. military could collapse within 20 years due to climate change, report commissioned by Pentagon says. So I'll talk about that. And also, a number of my recent tweets have been about these fires in California. California is 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit, which is just over, 1.2 or 1.3 degrees Celsius hotter than 1970. And that's the primary driver of a 5-fold increase in torch forests and wildfires, massive wildfires, huge structural damage in California. Big cities, entire towns are being evacuated, and the power is off. So the power is evacuation warning down here, fire up here, power grid is shut down, affecting, a million people. Here's basically, a hazardous, long duration, critical offshore wind event, huge wildfires, dry fuels, hot, dry fuels. So they're basically shutting down the power grid to deal with that. So have a look on my Twitter to see all of the details. Now, like I said, this is the article that I'll be talking about in all aspects and in great detail, in this video and in my subsequent videos. So basically a combination of, we've got to eat, we've got to drink, grow food. Lots of the water goes into growing food. When there's, fragile power grid, if we don't have power, we're basically back in the Stone Ages. And these resource limitations cause wars for resources. And these effects are not to be looked at individually, but they're all cascading, devastating effects that one builds up on another, which builds up on another. The whole system is like a stack of dominoes. And one of them tips over and it can bring down the entire system. Okay, so this report, which actually came out a few months ago, but it's only had recent press. Like this is a October 24th article by the great writer Nafiz Ahmed. Make sure you read his book. Now this is American-centric, but it applies all over the world. Americans could face a horrifically grim future from climate change, including blackouts, disease, in a hotter, warmer world. Diseases can spread to regions where they weren't before. We're talking about Zika. We're talking about diseases to people, but also diseases to plants, for example, emerald ash borer, pine beetle disease, things like that, weaken forests, make them more susceptible to wildfires. Of course, thirst, starvation, and war. The U.S. military itself might collapse, according to the report. And this could happen over the next 2 decades. It doesn't say within 2 decades, but it says over, it doesn't say in 2 decades, rather. It says over the next 2 decades. And we can see signs of these things happening now, and the total craziness in the U.S. centers of power, the government, and the denial. Those are all things which are, which are teetering on collapsing the whole system. Okay, so when you get huge instabilities in the climate, you get instabilities in everything, including in the way we govern. So the senior U.S. government officials who wrote the report are from the Army, DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, NASA, the Pentagon. Was urged to prepare for the possibility that domestic power, water, and food systems might collapse due to the impacts of climate change as we move towards the mid-century. General Mark Milley commissioned the report. He's Trump's new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so he's the highest ranking military officer in the country now. And of course, the report puts him at odds with Trump, who does not take climate change seriously. So it's called Implications of Climate Change for the U.S. Army, and I'll talk about it in detail. It was launched by the U.S. Army War College with NASA, and it was actually available publicly in August by the Center for Climate and Security, but it didn't get a lot of press at the time. Okay, so the two most prominent scenarios in the report, the first is a collapse of the power grid within the next 20 years. And this is very, very real, especially for people in California. Also, whenever we have, the power outages, if you look at power outages, over time we're getting more and more power outages affecting more and more people just from basic storms, torrential rain events leading to flooding, wind events, etc. Whole islands, whole countries are being trashed by slow-moving storms, including slow-moving hurricanes. We just saw that with Grand Bahama and Abaco Island, completely devastated by a parked Category 5 hurricane. We saw lots of damage from a typhoon in Japan, and that caused a huge risk to the nuclear waste and the power plants at Fukushima, for example. So these things are all cascading. Increased energy requirements triggered by new weather patterns like extended periods of heat, drought, and cold could eventually overwhelm an already fragile system. And this is a power system. Also, there are foreign interventions, like the Syria conflict was basically triggered due to climate-related impact. Record drought in Syria, farmers had to move out of the country, 1.5 million farmers into the cities, no jobs, basically, a lot of unrest in the cities, and the country broke up into civil war, and then many, many big players, Russia, U.S., other countries got involved. Now, Bangladesh is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate collapse in the world because such a large fraction of Bangladesh's surface area is very, very low elevation relative to sea level. A sea level rise of a meter or two will displace millions and millions and millions of people and cause huge unrest in an already explosive region. And this is just the permanent displacement of a large portion of the population of Bangladesh would be a regional catastrophe with the potential to increase global instability. Okay, this is only one country. Globally, over 600 million people live at sea level, basically. Sea level rise, which could go higher than 2 meters by 2100, according to one recent study, will displace tens, if not hundreds of millions of people, creating massive, enduring instability. Okay, so the report argues that the U.S. should be ready to act in these countries, and also, talks about the rapidly melting Arctic, and it says the U.S. military should take advantage of hydrocarbon resources there and new transit routes, basically, and be ready for conflict with Russia. I'll continue this. Thanks for listening.